Morning, good afternoon, good evening, gang. I just realized this is our last video. This is the last time I'm going to be able to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So yes, this will be the last video of the course. So because it's the start of the week, let's start where we are, where we're going. So we are into week 14. Dun, dun, dun. I have decided, rather than continue and introduce a new topic that I would feel rushed to do, that it's a rise of Hezbollah, I've decided to just sort of stop with Palestinian terror. We are going to get we're going to set up the Palestinian Liberation Organization. We're going to get them situated in Jordan, and then we're going to kick them out. And that is where we are going to leave the course. So as to what is going on, that's what's going to be happening. Where we were talking about Palestinian terrorism. And where we are going, week 15, there will be no video for that week. I will be in office hours on the 6th of December, that is a Monday, rather than on the Wednesday. I will make sure to set an alarm so I actually show up. But week 15, the 6th of December, 2359 is when your research paper is due. So if you have not started working on it, you might want to start a little bit of panic, or at least start working on it. I will be putting out the study guide for the final exam on the 6th of December as well. It will be on the 17th of December from 2 to 5 p.m. unless I am mistaken. Double check the syllabus, or in fact, what we're going to do right now, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to pause. I'm going to unpause and share another screen. Boop. So I just want to make sure this was up. So yes, indeed, exam 17 December, 2 to 5 p.m. 17 December is a Friday. So make sure you are there on Friday, the 17th of December from 2 to 5 p.m. Just like the midterm exam, you'll be receiving the final exam at your UR courses email shortly before 2 p.m. All right, so that is where we are. That's where we are going. So yeah, let's kick this off. All right, so going back to the old PowerPoint. So in the last video, we started at the end. We started with Yasser Arafat in 1974. And so we talked about the olive branch speech. We talked about how the speech is directed to two different audiences, and what, let me actually start the slide, what Arafat is trying to do with the olive branch speech. Then we started trying to set up the Palestinian terror. We started talking about why the Palestinians would shift toward, well, not really shift towards, but continue on with terror. Basically the fact that, well, they were not getting any support from the Arab states around them. 1948, Israel kicked their butts. 1954, Israel kicked Egypt's butt. 1967, Israel kicked Syria, Egypt, and Jordan's butt. 1973, the Arab states laid a really good blow on the Israelis, but then it turns around in the Yom Kippur War. Israel really militarily doesn't lose. So we talked about the refugees situation. We talked about these military setbacks. And so we ended off talking about how the Arab states viewed the Palestinian Liberation Organization as a way to continue the fight without getting their own hands dirty. So let's talk about the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Now, prior to 1964, there was no overarching umbrella organization for Palestinian resistance or terror against Israel. Not to make light of the situation, but if you've ever seen the movie Monty Python's Life of Brian, they have a scene where you have a discussion of naming of the naming of resistance groups against the occupying Romans. You have the People's Front of Judea, the Judean People's Front, the Popular Front of Judea, and a host of other names. At one point, a character quits because they thought it was a different group that they were affiliated with. Prior to 1964, this was how the Palestinian resistance and Palestinian terror was organized. It really wasn't. So in 1964, at the meeting of an organization known as the Arab League. So the Arab League consists of pretty much all the countries in green here. So from Morocco and Mauritania in the west, all the way to Oman in the east, including Iraq, basically the entirety of the Middle East except for obviously Israel. And Syria is a special little case that we're not going to get into. Somalia, Sudan, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, etc., etc. So in 1964, at a meeting of the Arab League, it was decided that an umbrella organization was required for Palestinian resistance to ensure a better coordination of Palestinian resistance to Israeli rule. And the Palestinian Liberation Organization was founded in 1964 at this meeting of the Arab League. The PLO was set up as effectively a government in exile to speak for and to govern the Palestinian refugees. At its core, the PLO mandate was to liberate Palestine through armed conflict. So why did the Arab states want an umbrella organization to sort of speak for and govern the Palestinian refugees? Well, in Jordan, you have almost 1 million Palestinian refugees, Syria 170, Egypt 35,000, Kuwait 170. So every Arab state has and this includes Palestinian refugees in the United States, Latin America, and Europe, 165,000. But every major member of the Arab League had a Palestinian refugee situation. And so it was decided, well, crap, we need to organize things so that we set up a government in exile and an organization to speak for and govern the Palestinian refugees. And as I said, at its core, the mandate for the Palestinian Liberation Organization was to liberate Palestine through armed conflict. Now, shortly, so if we look at before we go to the shortly part, if we look at the Palestinian Liberation Organization, how it's organized. We have the Fedayeen groups. These are the groups that are engaging in armed conflict against the Israelis. So we have Fatah, who we will talk about in a second. We have the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Arab Liberation Front, the General Command for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Popular Struggle Front, the Palestine Liberation Front, and others. So as you can see, you have all these smaller groups, but there's no coordination. The PLO was designed to sort of provide that coordination. And so you have the Palestine National Council at the top, sort of as the umbrella organization for not only the Fedayeen groups, the groups engaging in armed conflict against the Israelis, but you also have the Popular Organization. So the General Union of Palestinian Workers, General Union of Palestinian Women, General Union of Palestinian Students, teachers, etc., etc. So more of a less militant side and more popular organizations versus the Fedayeen, the armed conflict side. Making up the National Council, you have the PLO Central Council, from which the executive committee selects the members, and overarching as the overarching figurehead of the Palestinian Executive Committee would be the chairman of the PLO Executive Committee, so the chairman of the PLO. Under him, you would have the PLO Planning Center and the Research Center. The chairman would be in charge with consultation of the military department, the National Fund, political department, so on and so forth. So it's not just let's go and blow up the Israelis, but it's also a way to sort of keep the Palestinian refugees organized and cared for. Because while the Arab League set up the Palestinian Liberation Organization, they didn't really care. Well, they cared, but the focus of the Arab states was not so much let's care for these people, but more how can we get these people out of here? Oh, let's get the territory back. And shortly after the creation of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Army was founded as a military arm for the political organization. You may notice that the PLA, Palestinian Liberation Army, is all the way down here. So it's directly under the chairman of the PLO. But the Fedayeen kind of is. And the reason for that is these Palestinian Liberation Armies were funded and equipped by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. So Egypt, Syria, and Jordan funded and equipped these armies. The Palestinian Liberation Army was ostensibly under the control of the PLO, but for all intents and purposes, they were at the beck and call of their respective patron state. So you would have a Palestinian Liberation Army funded and equipped by Egypt, by a separate one by Jordan, a separate one by Syria. In the organization, they were under the control of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, but for all intents and purposes, Egypt was in charge of their army, Syria was in charge of their Palestinian Liberation Army, and Jordan as well. So, for example, during times of tension between Syria and Jordan in the 1970s, Syria used its Palestinian Liberation Army brigade to covertly put pressure on Jordan without the direct use of the Syrian military. They basically told its Palestinian Liberation Army brigade to sort of go and raid Jordan, to put pressure on Jordan so that they would submit to what we want them to do. This kind of changes in 1967 with the introduction of Fatah, F-A-T-E-H, also F-A-T-A-H, under the control of Yasser Arafat. So in 1967, Yasser Arafat brought his organization, Fatah, F-A-T-A-H, also F-A-T-E-H, under the PLO umbrella. And with this, Arafat brought not only a more independent military force under the PLO, but also Fatah was one that was trained and experienced in conducting covert attacks against Israel. So while Egypt, Syria, and Jordan sort of used their own Palestinian liberation armies for their own nationalist reasons, the introduction of Fatah allowed the PLO to have a more independent military force. And so, within 2 years of the introduction of Fatah into the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Arafat had secured his position within the PLO, becoming elected chairman of the organization, and established the Palestinian Liberation Organization within Jordan. Jordan, as we see here, outside of the West Bank and Gaza. So the West Bank, located here, after 1967, again occupied by Israel. Gaza Strip, located right there, again after 67, occupied by Israel. So 1.1 million outside of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. Jordan had the largest Palestinian population within its borders, so it made sense for Jordan, for Arafat to choose Jordan as the headquarters for the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And so we're going to start talking about the PLO in Jordan now. By the time Arafat had been elected chairman of the PLO, the organization had secured a base within northern Jordan from which it could launch attacks against Israel. So, actually, I have a better map. So, Palestinian bases located here in northern Jordan. And so the PLO and the Fedayeen were able to launch attacks from northern Jordan into the West Bank, into Israel proper as well. And so Israel kind of got a little perturbed with what was happening. Karameh, by the way, located right across the River Jordan from the West Bank. So located right here, that was the main base. And so based in northern Jordan, Karameh had become the center for Palestinian resistance against Israel, housing both a rather large Palestinian refugee camp, along with the PLO government in exile. Now, as I mentioned, the Palestinians would raid into the West Bank and Israel, launch attacks, and then run back into across the border into Jordan. And so that kind of upset Israel, and they said finally, enough of this. We're gonna finish this. And so the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, planned a raid against Karameh, from which they claimed the PLO engaged in rocket and mortar attacks against Israeli targets across the River Jordan. So Israel claimed, kind of rightly, that the PLO was launching mortar and rocket attacks on Israeli territory, and they were upset about this. So on 21 March 1968, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, sent a substantial force across the river, expecting little resistance from the Jordanian military, because Israel was in fact invading Jordan to take care of this Palestinian problem. So the IDF sent a substantial force across the river, expecting very little resistance from the Jordanian military, and we're expecting a very simple hit and run operation against the Palestinian Liberation Organization. What the IDF got, however, was a high-pitched battle between the IDF, the Jordanian military, and the Palestinian irregulars, the Palestinian Fedayeen. Now, militarily, both sides received a bloody nose. Roughly 30 killed and 100 wounded for the Israeli Defense Force, 60 killed, 175 wounded for the Jordanians, and 156 Palestinian killed. Tactically, the Israelis did destroy the Karameh camp, but failed to capture Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian leadership. The big upside for Arafat and the PLO was that it was a public relations coup. Yes, the Karameh refugee camp was attacked, was destroyed, but the Palestinians, from a public relations perspective, the Palestinians could say, we stood up to the big bad Israelis. And the Battle of Karameh established the PLO as an effective state within a state within Jordan. And so after 21 March 1968, after the Battle of Kermeh, the PLO were going, oh, ha, 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 ha. Where are the big dogs now? In Jordan, we're good, we're hip, we're happening. And the PLO was basking in its newfound position within Jordan as really the protectors of the Jordanian Palestinians, and many would flock to the PLO banner. And so the Palestinian fighters were starting to sort of feel their oats, starting to sort of exert their own pressure. They started openly flouting Jordanian laws, basically trying to claim that the Jordanian laws don't apply to us. But really, they became a thorn in the side of the leader of Jordan, King Hussein of Jordan. When they started, the Palestinians did, when the Palestinians started openly calling for the overthrow of the Hashemite monarchy. There's openly calling for the overthrow of King Hussein of Jordan. To that end, King Hussein of Jordan right here, to that end, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or at least members associated with them, attempted to assassinate King Hussein not once, but twice. Now, while an internal crisis is one thing, King Hussein was secure enough with his military to be certain that the Jordanian military would not go along with the Palestinians. They would actually go and back up King Hussein. The PLO caused an external crisis. And so in September of 1970, right there, September of 1970, we had the Dawson's Field hijackings. And in September 1970, you have members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP. See, I told you about all these different names. They were another different Fedayeen group. By the way, for those interested, Fedayeen, F-I-D-A, apostrophe I-Y-Y-I-N, pronounced Fedayeen. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, skyjacked 3 airliners and ordered them to be flown to a former British airfield in Jordan, then controlled by the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So Dawson's Field was a disused Jordanian airfield that the Palestinians had taken over. Now, the idea was not so much to use the passengers as hostages per se, but rather the airliners, the airplanes themselves. The Palestinian terrorists were more than willing to barter for the passengers and to keep them unharmed. But the airliners, the airplanes, were typically targeted as they were large outlays for the airline corporations. So passengers were one thing, but the Palestinians figured, well, the airlines spend a lot of money on these jets, so let's attack these jets. And what the Dawson's Field hijackings did, was brought more international attention to Jordan and to the PLO and on King Hussein himself. And that is one thing that King Hussein could not have. He needed international support to keep Jordan secure. I talked about with his grandfather, King Abdullah, how he needed British support to maintain Jordan's sovereignty because of all the external pressures. Well, Hussein needed international support as well, particularly from the United States. And so after the Dawson's Field hijackings, after the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, blew up the airliners on Dawson's Field, Hussein decided enough was enough and ordered the expulsion of the Palestinian Liberation Organization from Jordan. This would become known by the Palestinians. Get my face out of the way. This would become known by the Palestinians as Black September between 16 and 27 September 1970. Even though the Palestinian problem was an internal crisis for King Hussein in Jordan, he still needed to deal with the overall politics of the Middle East. Because from the Palestinian perspective, the PLO and other Palestinian groups were supported by the various Arab states, both financially and militarily. And so if Hussein acted without the spoken or unspoken sanction of the major Arabic states, particularly Egypt and Saudi Arabia, this would cause the political isolation of Hussein, the political isolation of Jordan, and further weaken the Jordanian regime. And so what Hussein did before he engaged in Black September was Hussein secretly negotiated with Gamal Abdel Nasser. We saw him with respect to Egypt. He's the leader of Egypt, Nasser. Hussein, the ruler of Jordan, secretly negotiated with Nasser, the ruler of Egypt, for an Egyptian promise to use their influence, to use Egypt's influence to focus the PLO efforts on Israel, and thereby not focusing on Arab states like Jordan, and said, look, so try to pressure them to keep their focus on Israel, not on Arab states like Jordan. And if they don't, should the PLO continue its actions in Jordan, Nasser promised not to interfere with any Jordanian retribution against the PLO. So Egypt basically said, look, this is an internal Jordanian problem. We will keep our hands off. We will try to tell the Palestinians to focus on Israel, but if they mess with an Arab state, they're gonna reap the whirlwind. They're gonna reap the consequences. And so throughout 1970, from the perspective of Israeli-Jordanian relations, there was a continued low intensity conflict between the two. So between 1968 and 1970, there was basically a tit for tat shelling between Israel and Jordan. Israel would shell Palestinians on Jordanian territory, and the Jordanian military would shell Israel in return. They launch a mortar attack, we launch a mortar attack, sort of thing. Now, Hussein was concerned quite legitimately after Karameh in 1968 that Israel would use the opportunity posed by Jordan's military focusing on the Palestinians to go on the offensive against Jordan. Now, you have to remember at this point, the Arab states, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, Syria particularly, did not recognize the existence of Israel. So Hussein could not talk directly to Israel and go, hey, we're dealing with this situation. Can you promise not to attack us? But what both Israel and Jordan did have was good relations with the United States. So King Hussein of Jordan was able to talk to the United States and send a message through the United States to Israel to negotiate. Well, essentially negotiating with the United States to negotiate with Israel so that Jordan still had sort of the fig leaf of not talking directly to Israel. So the Jordanians would talk to the United States would talk to Israel would talk to the United States would talk to Jordan, sort of thing. And through this game of diplomatic telephone, Israel confirmed to Jordan that Israel would not take advantage of any Jordanian military movements against the PLO. They basically said, look, if there are any Jordanian military movements, normally we would go on high alert, but we understand that in this case, you're dealing with the Palestinians, we will not use this to our advantage. And this negotiations, this confirmation, this kind of promise was backed and supported by the United States. So by September 1970, Hussein had a promise from Egypt not to interfere on the side of the Palestinians should Jordan move against him. Hussein had a promise from the Israelis that they would not use any Jordanian military movements against the Palestinians to their advantage. And so, on 16 September 1970, King Hussein of Jordan ordered his military to attack PLO military bases and to push the PLO out of Jordanian cities and Jordanian territories. Hussein's generals claimed it would take 2 to 3 days for the military to complete its mission against Palestinian liberation organizations. They were not taking, however, they did not take foreign intervention into their plan. Because while Jordan did get Egypt and Israel to agree not to do anything, the same could not be said for Syria. In particular, because Syria and Jordan were not really on the best of terms. And so if you remember, I'm going to get my face back here. So if you remember earlier in the video, I mentioned that Jordan, Syria, and Egypt both funded and equipped their own parts of the Palestinian Liberation Army. And so Egypt had its brigade of the PLA, Jordan had its brigade of the PLA, Syria had its brigade of the Palestinian Liberation Army. And even though they were ostensibly independent, they were still reliant on and directed, in this case, by the Syrian government, at least the Syrian version of the Palestinian Liberation Army. So 16 September 1970, Jordan moves against the major areas of the Palestinian Liberation Organization within Jordan. 2 days later, on the 18th of September, as we can see on this map, Syria, or at least the Palestinian Liberation Army in Syria, invaded Jordan to support the PLO against the Jordanian military. Now, the Syrians, for their part, played this off as, oh, no, we aren't telling them to do anything. This is an independent force, the Palestinian Liberation Army, going in to defend its own organization, the PLO. But everyone knew that this was a Syrian-directed attack against Jordan. Now, the most likely reason behind the Syrian attack was to try to seize a chunk of northern Jordan. So there was a political goal, try to seize a chunk of northern Jordan. But domestically for Syria, this was to sort of keep Syrian public opinion on side. Because at the time you had a conflict between the Syrian government with its own military, and this attack was to sort of provide the military assurances that yes, we're kind of following what you want. Now, what ends up happening, the Jordanian military, particularly its air force, managed to beat back the Syrian invasion and to provide time and breathing room for an Egyptian negotiated settlement between Syria and Jordan. Basically, Egypt stepped in and basically said said to Syria, what the heck are you doing? Back off, get on your side of the line. Jordan, they kicked your butt, Syria. They will not advance into Syria. So you just be happy that Jordan's not kicking your ass. And so between 16 and 27 September 1970, all the major bases within Jordan were attacked by the Jordanian military, which brings us to what's known as the Amman Agreement. There we are. The Amman Agreement, 13 October 1970. The Amman Agreement, 13 October 1970, was signed between Yasser Arafat, get my face back up here, signed between Yasser Arafat, chairman of the PLO, and King Hussein of Jordan. The Amman Agreement pledged the PLO to respecting Jordanian sovereignty. The PLO, in signing this agreement, said, we will respect Jordanian sovereignty within the territory of Jordan. While Jordan agreed that the PLO would be the sole Palestinian representative body. The PLO would be the only Palestinian representative body that would talk for the Palestinian refugees and fight for the Palestinian refugees. Now, while the Amman Agreement, 13 October 1970, settled things between Jordan and the PLO proper, splinter groups and offshoots of the PLO continued fighting against Jordan through July 1971. This would lead to the entirety of the Palestinian Liberation Organization being kicked out of Jordan and the PLO being forced to relocate into southern Lebanon after July 1971. In fact, it will be the presence of the PLO in Lebanon and their attacks against Israel that would pretty much cause major problems, including partly a Lebanese civil war, and cause a lot of the problems between Israel and the Arab world in the 1980s, really to the present. But I mentioned there were splinter groups. I mentioned there were people within the Palestinian Liberation Organization that were not happy with how things were going. And so we're going to jump a little ahead to talk about Munich 1972. Because disgruntled members of Fatah were upset that Arafat signed this agreement. And so they founded their own organization, the Black September Organization, founded by disgruntled members of Fatah in response to Black September and the PLO getting kicked out of Jordan. And so in Munich 1972, you have the Summer Olympic Games. And this was the first Olympic Games being held in Germany since the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And so on 5 September 1972, in fact, it was a Tuesday, September 5th, 1972, 8 members of the Black September Organization snuck into the Olympic Village in Munich, West Germany, and took 11 members of the Israeli Olympic team hostage. Shortly after the hostage taking took place at about 4:30 in the morning on 5 September 1972. Shortly after the hostage taking, the Black September Organization demanded the release of 234 individuals held in Israeli and Western prisoner in what 234 individuals held in Israeli and Western prisons. Easy for me to say. In exchange for the 11 members of the Israeli Olympic team. In addition, the Black September group demanded safe transit to Egypt. Now, West German authorities negotiated with Black September because Israel had an official policy of non-negotiation with terrorists. So West Germany did all the negotiations for Israel and ostensibly agreed to their demands. Now, the idea was to plan a rescue at Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base. Easy for me to say. How do you spell it? Well, you spell it like this. Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base, where the hostages and the hostage takers would be taken. Again, ostensibly, oh yes, we are going to get you an airplane. It's at this airfield. We'll send a helicopter. We will get you to the airfield. But the plan was to have a rescue at the airfield. But plans rarely survive contact with the enemy. So the hostage takers and the hostages were flown by helicopter to the nearby airport, where they were met with a waiting aircraft. In theory, the air crew was to be German undercover police, and the plane was to be watched by snipers. The problem was that the undercover air crew decided, yeah, this is a really bad idea because, well, you've been on airplanes before, you know how little room there is. And so if we fight against the terrorists with machine guns, well, that's kind of hazardous to our health. So the undercover aircrew decided to abandon the plan, believing that it was too dangerous for both themselves and the hostages to try to overpower the hostage takers in such a confined space as the aircraft, which left the snipers alone to take on the Black September group. And so this is where we get the Munich massacre. When the helicopters land at 10:35 a.m., two members of the Black September group went forward to check on the plane while the rest remained with the helicopters. They arrive at the airplane, look around, and find the aircraft completely empty. There's no air crew to fly them. So the two men ran back to the helicopters, and the snipers opened fire. In the resulting battle between 10:44 and 12 and by this point 10:44 p.m. and 12:10 a.m., so shortly after midnight, most of the hijackers and all of the hostages were killed. Two of the hostages were killed earlier at the Olympic Village, and 9 were killed at the airfield. The hijackers, when they realized that they were not going to succeed, turned around and shot their bound hostages. 3 of the hijackers survived their wounds, and their release in 1973 in exchange for hostages of a skyjacked German aircraft prompted an extreme reaction from Israel. Israel was not happy the next year after these men were released. But we have the aftermath. For some of you who may have seen the Spielberg movie Munich, this might be familiar. For those of you who have not, let's talk about the aftermath of Munich. So in the aftermath, Israel, under Prime Minister Golda Meir, M-E-I-R, retaliated against the Palestinians and Black September. Meir directed Mossad, M-O-S-S-A-D, that is the Israeli intelligence agency, to go after those who planned the Munich attack. Obviously, they could not go after the perpetrators themselves, as they were killed, as most were killed at the airfield in Germany. And again, the Steven Spielberg movie Munich depicts the Mossad attacks against the Palestinians. This attack, known as Operation Wrath of God, also known as Operation Bayonet, Mossad targeted members of the Black September Organization and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. In particular, they targeted Ali Hassan Salameh. Ali, A-L-I, middle name Hassan, H-A-S-S-A-N, Salameh, S-A-L-A-M-E-H. I believe I have his name. I don't, but it will be on the PowerPoint once the video is over. Ali Hassan Salameh, S-A-L-A-M-E-H, was the man who they believed spearheaded the entire organization. So between 1972 and 1988, Mossad assassinated 19 members of the PLO and the Black September Organization, causing a tit-for-tat campaign between the PLO and Israel, including the PLO attempting to kill Prime Minister Golda Meir by shooting down her plane as she traveled from Israel to the Vatican in early 1973. But as I said, Ali Hassan Salameh was at the top of the Mossad hit list for his planning, or at least they believed planning, of the Munich attack. And so in June 1973, we have what's known as the Lillehammer Affair, Lillehammer, Lillehammer, Norway, site of the 92 Winter Games, I believe. But you have the Lillehammer Affair in June 1973. In June 1973, Mossad had believed without a shadow of a doubt that they had located Salameh in Lillehammer, Norway, and sent a team to deal with them. However, the Mossad team, after they killed their target, found out that they killed Ahmed Boucheki, B-O-U-C-H-E-K-I, a Moroccan with no affiliation to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, nor any affiliation to Black September. So a Mossad team of 15 agents was sent to the small town of Lillehammer. Even today, Lillehammer only has about 28,000 people in it. So the arrival of a number of foreigners caught the interest of local police, and they started following the Mossad team. Mossad agents noticed that a known courier for the Palestinian Liberation Organization, who they had been following, talked with Boucheki at a local swimming pool, suggesting to Mossad that Boucheki may indeed be their target. Additionally, a female Mossad agent swam nearby to Boucheki and this courier and overheard him speaking French, which to Mossad confirmed their mistaken identity of Boucheki as Salameh. Salameh was known to be multilingual, and it made sense that Boucheki would be speaking French, his native language. After several days of watching Boucheki and his home, the Mossad agents gunned him down outside of his home as he returned from the movies with his pregnant wife. Boucheki's murder was the first killing in Lillehammer, Norway in over 30 years, causing the police to quickly move in on the Mossad team. 9 members of the team managed to flee Norway, while 6 members were caught by the Norwegian police. Their identities were quickly established, including the location of the Mossad safe house, and at the safe house, they found incriminating documentation. The clear evidence of targeted assassinations by Israel prompted Golda Meir to officially pause Operation Wrath of God, only to have the operation officially restarted under Prime Minister Menachem Begin, formerly of the Irgun, in 1982. Several cells of the operation would disregard the Prime Minister's orders and continue to pursue Salameh and other Palestinians. Mossad will finally assassinate Salameh in 1979 in Beirut, Lebanon, via a remote detonated car bomb. The car bomb killed Salameh and 4 of his bodyguard, as well as 4 other civilians, and injured another 16 civilians. So, on that note, we are going to end our discussion of terror in the 19th and 20th centuries. I hope you guys enjoyed the class. I certainly did. So for the very last time, go forth, slay dragons, and I won't see you in the next video. All right, take care. Bye.